We'll just do a really quick overview from the last time and then kind of dive into more of a discussion around beneficial electrification and demand flexibility. We have anyone else waiting, Crystal? I can't see, or maybe we should just go ahead and get started.
Go ahead and get started. No one else is waiting.
Yeah, okay. Well, great, thanks for joining. Let's see if I can, oh, there we go. Just if you could just please write your name and company or add it to your Zoom name, that would help with recording attendance. Wanted to do a really quick meeting 7 review. I think all of you were in attendance, but if not, we had group 14 review the BPS policy tool, and Kim just emailed that out. I think it was earlier today. We did make a few updates to it since they showed it to you last. So hopefully you can play around with that tool. Let us know if you have any questions about it, and we can still make changes to that tool. It is kind of an iterative process. I can't say that word today. Anyway, so at meeting 7, we also discussed the different compliance options for the BPS, and we had a preliminary vote on compliance options. And we were pretty pleased with the outcomes from the last meeting. The task force reached consensus on recommending that the BPS use a building property type specific site EUI target. We talked about renewable energy, and we recommended, the task force approved the recommendation that the AQCC partially credit renewables based on avoided grid emissions if the building owners retain the RECs or the REC is retired on behalf of the owner. And we might revisit that a little bit. I've heard from a few task force members about slightly modifying that language or really adding to it. So we can always take a few minutes at the next meeting to talk about that. And then we did have, the task force did come together to recommend that the AQCC encourage building owners to replace fossil fuel equipment at the end of life with efficient electric technologies. So today we really wanted to dive in a little bit more to beneficial electrification, review some additional straw proposals, and really hear from you on how we should structure those proposals so that we can go into the next meeting and move forward with voting on that. Same thing with demand flexibility. We didn't get to any of that during the last meeting, so wanted to dive into that a little bit more. So let's start with beneficial electrification. I don't think I need to go into what this is again, but really we just want to figure out how the task force can best encourage or potentially credit actions around beneficial electrification. So this overarching recommendation at the top was kind of how what the task force agreed to. The majority of members agreed to recommend that the AQCC encourage building owners to replace fossil fuel, space, and water heating equipment at end of life with efficient electric technologies. We recognize that this is a really broad statement, and we wanted to provide more context and really deepen those recommendations if possible, if the task force was looking to do that. Because we do want to kind of figure out, well, what does it mean for a building owner? How do we get credit? Does this help us comply with the BPS? So that's why we wanted to dive into and really just hear from all of you what you think about some of these ideas or straw proposals. And here we kind of just wrote out some here based on what we thought the task force could potentially come to consensus around. And then we added in a few notes about kind of where our discussions went last time. I know that cooking was brought up. We talked about fractional credit if part of the building's energy load was electrified. So things like that. So we wanted to kind of open it up for questions, and we'll just take some notes and again, this is going to help us move forward at the next meeting with some stronger proposals that the whole task force can react to. So I'll open it up for discussion now. And I can't see everyone, so feel free to just jump in there. No need to raise your hand.
Okay, well, I'll jump in.
Okay, Bill, go for it.
Here we go. So, partial credit for partial electrification, I think, is very important, because in cases where you cannot use heat pumps, well, let me put this there. When you are using the heat pumps, as we get down to about -5 degrees, -10 degrees, it would really help if we could back that system up with gas, and it'd be only for a few hours, and it reduces the size of equipment. The equipment, when you get down that low, you're getting pretty close to a COP of 1. And so your demand at that temperature is as high as resistance heating, and the grid can't take it. And so, if we want to be careful with grid demand, that is critical. So that makes our systems much easier to design and much easier to meet loads, and not have to triple the electric service to do it.
Okay, so for example, then how would you write that recommendation? Something along the lines of C, fractional credit for partial electrification, or something like that, or?
Right. Yeah. I think, for these purposes, I don't know that you need to get in the weeds, but
right.
But you need to not be so strict as to say it has to be all electric or nothing, because some people may not be able to do that. And quite frankly, Excel can't do it either. And so if you give them, the ability to do, at very low temperature, a little bit of gas, you won't increase grid emissions, and you'll make it possible for many people, especially retrofits.
Yeah. Okay, Kara?
Yeah, thanks. I completely agree with Bill. I think that encouraging and allowing for partial electrification is really important. And I've seen some studies that show like electrification based on load, like fractional load, is actually really beneficial. Like not, and Bill, you've probably seen these too, like not based on the total on capacity electrification, but based on load, like the hours that you need heating. And so that might be something, again, it's probably too granular for us to propose as a policy, but I don't know if there's ways that our policies could insinuate more like load-based sizing rather than capacity-based sizing. I think one other thought while I have the floor is if we could, I appreciate kind of the addition and call out of space and water heating equipment. And I might propose, I think that makes it specific and actionable. So I really appreciate that. I might propose adding kind of an at or before the end of life, because I don't think we want to just say people do it when your equipment's done. I think if they have other reasons, or I don't think we want to kind of preclude any earlier electrification of equipment. Thanks.
Yeah, I like that. We can
Yeah,
propose that to the group.
If they do it before their boiler craps out, they can use the boiler for the backup heat, right? I mean, that really makes sense. So,
I mean, would it make sense to just take out at end of life and then just leave it open for building owners to decide when?
Sure. I think that'd be good.
Yeah, we can take this forward to the group next time for a revision and change that.
I also had a question on that one. It's allowing building owners, and it depends on what the building is. And I don't know that that's going to be enough for certain buildings. And some of them I'm thinking of is the multifamily. There's so many opportunities besides just the heat and water systems that I get nervous about just lumping all buildings into number one.
Well, we can propose additional recommendations. We're just kind of did one overarching one to start, but then we could kind of call out specific property types if you want, or, really whatever you think makes sense.
Yeah, and I guess I was looking at E, which is
Oh,
cooking,
E. Oh,
right?
sorry. Yeah.
No,
These
no,
were
I was
just,
looking at A, but I mean, I was thinking when there's cooking in the building of any kind, could they electrify their cooking? And that's going to be a biggie, for a lot of people is getting off of the gas for cooking. So anyway, I just thought I'd mention maybe if we could get to that on A, if there is cooking, then it would need to be electrified too.
Hmm. I wanted to turn it over to Stacy because he's had his hand up for a little while. Sorry. Go ahead, Stacy.
That's okay. Maybe I'm not sure that I agree with the conversation that's been had. I think the general thrust of this is going in the right direction. The only part that I guess I want to voice is I'm going to wish you good luck as you try to draft some elegant wording so that this whole show documentation part doesn't eat the energy office alive, right? Like if you can write this in such a way that that building owners are going to make these efforts in good faith, and anyway, I just don't want the documentation side of the process to actually kill the project on the backside because the building owner goes, I don't even understand the rules. I don't want to go through the documentation part, and then they do nothing, or worse, I don't want the documentation side to become the disincentive for making the beneficial electrification partial progress or full progress or whatever it may be. So I'm just calling that out and wishing you good luck in how you craft that language.
I will resign before this all happens. No, I'm kidding. I'm kidding.
Smart.
But that's a really good point, Stacey. We have to think about verification and those and what kinds of documentation would be needed, both on the building owner side and from the state side. So I appreciate you bringing that up. And I mean, we can put in some kind of recommendation around, streamlining, minimizing some other kinds of verification processes. I don't think we can just go for, yeah, I said I did it, so therefore I did it. But if you have ideas on that, feel free to comment, throw those in the chat or whatever, and we can include those in the recommendations as well.
This is Katrina from Denver. I like the direction this is going. I wonder, I think there's a lot of details within how we might give credit for partial electrification. And so I'd love to see the group focus more. And I don't know if we could actually make some of the edits that we're proposing live in real time, Kim, if this is an editable slide, because I think we all liked one of the edits that was suggested to the opening language. And so just a question, could we actually make some of the edits live in real time, and could we get a little bit deeper on what the language should actually say on partial electrification, because our renewable heating and cooling plan that studied how to electrify existing buildings showed that partial electrification is the path forward for most existing buildings. So this whole fully electrified bit is not what most buildings will do. So the first two bullets seem fine to me. They don't cover the actual path of most buildings. So I'd love to go deeper.
Yes, let me see if I can share this then while Crystal is typing.
Yeah, I think you'll have to share your Google Chrome screen, but it won't be in PowerPoint view. Also, as I'm making these live edits, everyone on the task force, feel free to call out or say if I'm typing anything wrong. It can be hard to type as you guys talk, so bear with us.
It's hard to remember what the last slide was. Could it possibly just be that we make edits on the last slide? Do you need to save a new version? I don't want to delete yours. I just don't remember I don't want to mess up your versions, but I don't remember what it was.
Can you see the previous one now?
Yeah, could we just edit here?
Yep.
That would be amazing.
Okay. What should we change?
In the first sentence, we said we would take out at end of life. And the first two. I don't know that they're that relevant. No existing building is going to fully electrify. They don't have the electrical. It's just wildly expensive. They don't have the electrical capacity.
Well, some small ones might, smaller buildings might be able to,
Yeah.
but the bigger buildings probably not.
We found even small buildings don't have the electrical capacity available to fully electrify. They
Yeah.
can use their air conditioning electrical capacity to cover 80% of their heating load in small buildings, but not all of it.
Right.
usually.
Right.
So you
Nori,
just have
did you have
electrical
your,
upgrades. And I mean, yes, they could do it. I just don't think very many of them will, because it's expensive electrical upgrades.
You
Gotcha.
know, it
Nor-
depends on the building. Some buildings
Totally.
have pretty stout electrical systems. Wellington Webb, for instance, has a huge electrical system. So
Mhm.
it may
Right.
be able to.
Got it. Okay. Yeah, so leave A and B. How would we draft? Yeah, I don't know. I don't have
Would-
the proposed. I would love to hear more discussion before we sort of draft what happens with partial.
Yeah, let's hear
about-
from Nori. She had her hand up.
Sorry.
Oh, yeah. And I think Bill kind of answered it, but I'm just grateful that some of the recent multifamilies that we built, we designed it all electric from the beginning. Otherwise, putting in those giant boxes, whatever they're called, not the panel, but the other thing, would have been transformers, took so long. And that was critical. And so I'm really thankful that we can just like rubber stamp a couple that are fully electric for the low income multifamily. And then the other thing that I was going to think about was when we're looking at that end of life, like for the low income big renovations, it's basically subject to financing. So if the system is close to end of life, you start your financing cycle in order to do that new boiler replacement or get rid of the hydronic towers or the ancient equipment that's in there. So I like not totally at end of life, because we're going to start, it's really going to be subject to financing for the low income component. But I think we all get the point that we're not going to replace something that's fully functional, especially the low income community. They're going to stretch it out, raise funds, and then do a big rehab on whatever equipment they can. So I guess those were my only thoughts. Thanks.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And again, this is really just a recommendation around encouraging. So there is no requirement in here. We're just trying to figure out, again, how to incentivize building owners to move this direction.
And last thing, hot water doesn't mean hydronic systems. That's just hot water heating, right? When we're saying fully electrify heat and hot water systems. Oh,
It's a
okay,
good question. I
answered
mean,
that.
we can specify it.
I think it means domestic hot water.
Okay.
Yeah, I think it's for building, not building heat, but domestic hot water.
Yeah, that was the intent.
Got it. Perfect.
We can again modify any of these proposals the way we want.
And the basic concept of that was to get rid of the water heater, correct?
Well, to get rid of the fossil fuel, yeah,
The
water heater
water
potentially,
heater burning fossil
yeah,
fuel. Yep,
Mhm.
okay.
Right. But if we're Katrina's point, A, maybe doesn't really make sense, or you don't think it's really realistic to put in there. So
But to Bill's point, maybe some buildings could do it. I don't have a problem leaving it and see what the task force all thinks. I might just add that word domestic before hot water and then.
Yeah, and you might say fully or at least a significant portion of the building heating and domestic hot water. And maybe you leave significant kind of loosey-goosey, but yeah, if you did 80%, it would be huge.
Yeah, I was going to suggest 75 just because you have to have a number in there. I just feel like people have to have a target.
Yeah, right.
What Kim will be the process to figuring out, to Stacy's point, like how can and should we verify this? And Bill, or others, I don't know if you have suggestions on like simple ways or documentation. I mean, I assume all these buildings, they're big buildings, so they'd have to have kind of an engineer stamp on this. Is it part of a simple engineering calculation that we could weave into or request information out of? Like, how do we even?
Well, buildings at that size, your buildings have an automated system where most of all of your systems are documented by the second or minute. It's just the labor hand inside your maintenance department needs to know how to use it. But I mean, take a hospital, for example, every system in that building is recorded and monitored by somebody at the other side of a computer. You're talking medical gas, you're talking their electricity use, their light use, their fire alarm. It's all building automation.
You could do it through Energy Star. Energy Star gives you, I mean, if you look at a building profile, it's pretty easy to see the natural gas use or steam use as compared to electric use. So, from a gross aggregate standpoint, that's one possibility. And, Denver is doing this. So Katrina probably has some suggestions. Right, Katrina?
I think he was just
I mean,
asking
we're
about,
doing
yeah.
it through code though. And so when someone goes to replace their equipment, they can't get a permit unless it's for certain equipment. But yes, I think out of that, there would be lessons learned on what might need to be reported to the state to demonstrate a certain degree of electrification. I don't think it's incredibly easy to demonstrate. Not all buildings have that kind of BAS system. How would you know that it really is a certain percentage? It will be a rabbit hole. I do think it's probably a solvable problem and that we will have some lessons learned as we get into all of our code language and electrification feasibility reports to help guide that.
But your benchmark would have it, right?
Well,
Energy Star would show up.
One thing I don't want to, I'm not jumping on Katrina here. But one thing to keep in mind too is renewables. Although the renewables may not be lowering the site EUI, if a building is using more renewables, that would also show a higher electricity usage than natural gas. So then how would the state know if that was renewables or electrification?
Renewables would show up as a reduction in electric use, I think. They offset grid use. So
yeah, it's a great question, Bill. Like, you're wondering, could we just demonstrate electrification? Could building owners demonstrate electrification through their benchmarking report through reductions in gas use?
Right, because you have an energy report that shows you exactly how many kBTUs of natural gas you used and how many kBTUs of electricity.
Yeah, that's right. And if it will vary some by building. I think we'd still maybe want them to submit something, but we could, right? But I think the state can figure it out. They might need something submitted and then they check it. to make sure it was generally looked right with the gas data from Portfolio Manager, because you get one natural gas usage for the whole year number from Portfolio Manager. You don't get one for domestic hot water and a separate one for space heat. Usually that's about a 1/3, 2/3 split, but that varies by building type. Domestic hot water, it's a lot more multifamily. Like it's not going to be that easy to tell exactly what happened, but it would be simpler, right? Like, could you just credit, oh, your EUI is less if you cut gas use in particular, essentially is what you're wondering, right?
Yep.
We don't really care how you cut the gas use. Electrification will be a major strategy for cutting your gas use.
Right. You replaced your natural gas stoves with something, or your gas water heater with a heat pump, you know, it would just show up as natural gas reduction.
I'm gonna turn to, because I see that Stacy and Jill have their hands up. Stacy, do you want to go first?
Sure. Yeah, I just wanted to say, I'm recalling how part of how all this started too. The concept of saying that we want to encourage beneficial electrification, we need to make some allowances as people go through the process of electrifying their buildings, that, you know, we're going to use this site EUI as our target, but we're really talking about reducing emissions. And so some of the concerns back in the early parts of this conversation were, when you initially electrify, on today's grid, your emissions might go up. There's, you know, it may or may not be reflected in your site EUI. I don't know how that works between gas and electric necessarily, but your emissions may increase a little bit in the short term as you electrify. And yet we still want to encourage that because we have faith in the direction of the greening of the grid. So I just want to acknowledge that nuance as a possibility, or as something that we were trying to accomplish, I think, in this conversation. But I agree with Bill's point too, that as you report all of your energy uses through Portfolio Manager, you can look at the history and see what's going down and what's going up, and whether that changed or how that changed your EUI. And just want to throw in real quick too, with Crystal's comment or this question about renewables, I think the rule is, if you have any renewables on site, you're supposed to have a separate meter and reflect that meter as such in Portfolio Manager. So again, the Portfolio Manager report that's received by the state would have all of this information in it.
Thanks, Stacy. Joel?
Wanted to share, I put this in the comments also, but on the utility side, if someone is applying for a rebate for this equipment, we require an invoice, has to itemize the equipment, has to itemize the labor. Within that, you can require them to submit the make and model of the equipment so that you have documented these are the steps they've taken to electrify. I do also like Katrina and Bill's suggestion, monitoring or auditing their natural gas usage at that site. But the way I see that coming about is they could apply for an exemption or for this pathway and certify that they're meeting these things as evidenced by an invoice, and then the state follows up with some sort of checks and balances to verify using that natural gas data. To me, that seems like a good process.
I like the direction you're going, Joel, because building owners want certainty. They want to know that, and the AQCC needs to give them that. If I electrify this water heating system, my EUI target goes down by this much. They don't want to wait and see how much gas they save and see how far that gets them necessarily. But you could have both options for, and like, just, you'd have to keep them equal.
Yeah, I guess I like the idea of, like, it's not just one thing. I know Jenny mentioned that, you know, there's some folks who just, they know you're going to have that documentation. Other people who could either submit the rebates, or be great if they had a menu of acceptable documentation, because this is not all buildings. They're all so different.
And again, you're giving some leeway, which is always a good feeling back to that building owner. He's again, or she is again, in some kind of control of decision being made. You're not mandating, you're not being told what to do. You have some kind of interactive process how your building is being handled. It makes that building owner a lot easier to work with and a lot more willing to do the work.
Great, I like that. So we can definitely bring forth the, oh, sorry, Kirk, go ahead.
Oh, I'm sorry. And I'm sorry for coming late, everyone. The percentages in option A, is that based on square footage or based on load?
That's a good question. I think we were thinking load, but we can be more specific about that.
I would add that it should be heating and water heating load, or it's gas. And actually domestic hot water, you do almost always fully electrify. So at least for simpler systems. It's not all load. It's not like all electricity. It's heating load.
Well, I think if we are trying to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions of the building stock, it has to be total load. And whether it's heating or cooling or plug load, I don't know that it matters. And I'm not sure you'd report it that way in portfolio manager anyway. It's just load.
But it's the gas loads that carry a lot of emissions intensity once the grid is clean.
Right. Although, you know, the point I made is as we add things like biogas and hydrogen to natural gas, it will also start going down in carbon intensity.
The studies I've seen are that those even those sources maxed out can cover under 5% of the gas that we use today, though. So yes,
right.
We should reevaluate for technology in the future, right? But
right.
For now, what we need to electrify is the space and water heating load, because that's 97% of the gas use. And so it needs to be the heating and water heating system loads that are electrified. I do wonder though, if like in terms of documentation, sorry, I can pause, but maybe I'll toss it out because I think it's related. On documentation, like would another form of acceptable documentation be that you could just actually have gas reduction targets that the buildings have to hit? So if you don't want to invoice equipment, like if you just show that your gas is going down,
sure,
it helps hit the emissions target very well. Like we could have an alternate. I don't know if that overcomplicates things, like, but yeah.
If the gas is going down, wouldn't the overall EUI be going down? So wouldn't that be difficult to kind of tease out? Wouldn't you want the additional equipment documentation?
The EUI would be going down, but gas is usually only 20 or 30% of a building's energy usage. And so, but it's by 2030, the gas will be most of the emissions. Like the gas in 2030 maybe 30% of a building's EUI, but it is 80% of a building's emissions because the electricity has been decarbonized so significantly. And so we could set gas savings targets that are like an alternate compliance pathway. It's not some, yeah, if we wanted to.
It'd be interesting to look at that just from ease of compliance and certainty from building owners.
Is this something that we would need to get input from our building owners when we do our stakeholder outreach as to, as Jenny was saying, make sure they're engaged and so they understand what kinds of things? I mean, because all of this sounds really good to me if it gets where we need to go for the 2026.
Yeah, that's a great point, Karen. Thank you. Well, yeah, I think we have some ideas, some proposals to put forth. We can talk a little bit more about it at the meeting. Oh, Jenny, go ahead.
I'm sorry, I'm gonna bring up this point again because maybe my timelines and everything in my head got jumbled, but when does this hit residential?
There are no plans to hit residential. Yeah, it's really just
Big buildings.
50,000 square feet or more through 2030. So, yeah.
Okay, I will again bring up just the point. I know I'm the electrician in the room, which does allow me the actual reality of price checks. The price on all of this. Please allow some incentive leeway credits for those low income buildings. This is going to get trickled down from that building owner's pocket to those individuals. And man, just because we're going green doesn't mean that we need to offset more people who are struggling in our cities right now. So please keep that in mind. Yes, we have a great idea and a great responsibility to go green, but don't eat the people up while we do this, okay?
Yeah, definitely. I think that should be one of our foremost recommendations, that we need to keep affordability in mind and make sure that we are not negatively impacting the residents of affordable housing. So I think we have some good ideas here. Again, some of this we'll have to work on a little bit more, but and good point that we do need input from the building owners during the public stakeholder engagement process as well. Wanted to move on to, let's see.
Could I just,
yeah.
oh, sorry. I don't know if did we finish fleshing out the partial?
Not really, but I kind of wanted to talk a little bit about demand. I think we'll talk a little bit more about this during the next meeting too. I just do want to allow a little bit of time for demand flexibility.
Okay.
So again, just going back to a couple of meetings ago, we talked a little bit about demand response, grid interactive, efficient buildings and flexibility. And these were just a few of the comments that we pulled from the Miro board around thoughts around demand flexibility. That, you know, this pathway is important. It could be modeled off of various metrics like the grid optimal metrics. So anyway, we wanted to just give an quick reminder of that. But really, we need to figure out how, again, we're going to encourage or potentially credit demand flexibility actions. The issue is it's going to be difficult to model this for Group 14 to model the effects from any actions that building owners take. So it will be a little bit of a challenge to figure out how to really provide that credit to building owners, because we don't know exactly what that emissions reduction is going to look like from those individual building owner actions. But again, we could come up with some overarching proposals or recommendations to the AQCC around, again, encouraging or incentivizing demand flexibility. So these are some straw proposals that we wrote. Again, they're pretty high, overarching, high level, and we can dig down a little bit more and provide more specific recommendations if you'd like. But again, this is kind of an evolving topic that no one has really figured out yet in other states or cities around their BPSs, how to credit demand flexibility. So there's a lot of people working on it and coming up with various metrics, but still a little bit of an unknown. Yeah, Joel.
Okay, so I have some strong opinions on this one. So demand response typically does not involve actually just permanently reducing a load. It's offsetting it, right? You delay your air conditioning until nighttime hours, or you pull it forward towards solar hours. The problem with that I see is if we are trading, say, natural gas generation on peak for baseload coal power, then the result is we have actually increased emissions through demand response. So instead of air conditioning on peak using natural gas, they're air conditioning off peak using coal. So that to me is a loophole that we would have to close with this type of proposal. I would suggest that the future of demand flexibility will really be geared more towards integrating renewables. And I think that's what we should focus on here is demand flexibility that is used specifically for the purpose of integrating renewables, not trading natural gas for coal.
You know, I think demand response is critically important to keep peak down during certain times, and that will help, you know, everybody. We went and looked at the Heinz building downtown, and they have a system that turns off their electric resistance heat in sequence to keep their demand below a certain amount. And that is exactly what I think we should credit, is stuff like that. You know, their peak demands 2400 kW. Without that, it's like 3500 kW. It's a huge difference. So I could see stuff like that being extremely beneficial.
I think one, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, I'm back to that whole cost to the building owner. If it reduces their cost in addition to the benefit, I guess I agree.
And I was just going to say, I think we should edit this language to not provide credit just for a building that has grid flexible capabilities, but that they are actually enrolled in a real program that is utilizing those capabilities. And I don't know how complicated that tracking might get.
Yeah, I was going to say
those
this
programs
is,
don't exist in our market yet for commercial buildings. In fact, I don't think there's any in our market for commercial buildings. This is all very futuristic.
yeah, I have this part and participate in a demand response program, but we can kind of modify that. So they both have to employ the building automation system and participate in a program, but we can modify that, for example.
May I ask another silly, maybe
Yeah.
ignorant question at this point? So with the install of Excel smart meters on all these buildings, wouldn't that the purpose behind those smart meters going in?
Yeah, it certainly helps, but then they still have to enroll in a separate demand response type of program.
Okay, so the smart meter is just the brain, the individual has to do the rest, basically.
And maybe somebody else could, who knows more about that, can speak to that.
Sure, I can share some.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So
Thank you.
for demand response, there's typically a couple of options. There's behavioral, which means we set a rate, like a time of use rate, and you use less on peak just through your own behavior, through flipping off switches. And then there's automated demand response. So we have some software head end that communicates out with thermostats and devices and signals them how to respond. We do have that today with our commercial and industrial customers. We send out a SCADA signal. And if they respond to that, there's some incentive to them for reducing loads on peak. So there's a couple of different ways of doing that. And then the AMI that you mentioned, Jenny, is really the measurement and verification piece of that.
Thank you, Joel.
Thank you, Joel.
Nori, did you still have a comment? Sorry.
Yeah,
missed
I
you.
think this is super helpful. I don't notice this on kind of the multifamily properties that are in our portfolio, but I was looking at the CO tool, the BPS tool, and it looks like there's less than 300 buildings that are putting out about 20 million energy use. And then there's over 5,000 that are at like 26. And so I was wondering, since those buildings over 500,000 square feet are generating taking a lot of the load, if we could just pilot this demand flexibility with the bigger buildings and leave everybody else out of it, because I don't know that the other building owners would have access to already installed grid interactive efficient building technology or equipment.
Probably the simplest way that they could, like a multi-unit dwelling, would be smart thermostats. If they have smart thermostats on the wall and they connect those to a head end at the utility level, that's the criteria to participate. Costs them $200 for the smart thermostat. So it's not a big jump as far as HVAC goes.
And so the resident, the tenants in that apartment that even if they crank it up and open the windows, if you're enrolled in the program, you still get the incentive or the benefit?
Yeah, because you cannot cut people off completely from adjusting their own thermostats. There needs to be some flexibility, some opt-out. But realistically, what we see is maybe 2%, 5% opt-out on the high end. So participation and demand response generally tends to be very strong.
Good.
What about the electric vehicle battery storage and that kind of thing? Is that a part of this discussion? Because I mean, I was thinking about Nori's multifamily, because I think Aurora Water's doing that.
I agree. I'm glad you brought that up, Karen, because I think battery storage and/or vehicle to grid should be a part of this category. If they can discharge onto the grid during a demand event, that should qualify as well.
Another ignorant question, just because I'm happy to have Joel here to answer it for me. So Excel's new, I believe it's called time of use rate, that is going into play now in 2021, which will, from what I understand in my own brain, it is on and off peak hours, correct? Isn't this same concept?
So that's more of the behavioral category that I mentioned.
Okay.
So basically,
See,
when you
so I
use
gotta
power,
get out of that thought.
yeah, if you
Okay.
use power on peak, you pay more for it. That's kind of the trade-off there. I think what we're contemplating here is more automated, where a device communicates with the grid in some automated way so that it responds accordingly. It's not just somebody flipping off lights and switches based on a price. But Kim, am I correct in that assumption? Is that kind of the direction that?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, that's at least the proposal, but we can, again, modify these however you think we need to.
There was one other consideration, because we're in an incentive program with Excel with the city of Aurora, where you run our generators during peak load, which is not where we're going with this. So if we could not do that, you have to do something else, and you either get penalized for using your fossil fuel generator to reduce peak or whatever. But does that make sense?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, I agree with what Karen's just saying. We don't want to incentivize people to fire up their natural gas generator and avoid the peak and then be in compliance. And that's part of why I say, I mean, this should be for the purpose of integrating renewables, which I think is the long-term picture here, not just shifting more load onto natural gas.
Yeah, I think that's why this is hard to talk about because it's not here yet. But I'm wondering if we can write some of the correct principles that the AQCC should consider in the future. And I think I'm hearing them here from task force members, things like this should be credited when it's enabling renewables and not just a shift from fossil generation. This should be credited to the extent that of the emission reductions that it results in, right? And per kilowatt hour saved, this can result in a lot of emission reductions, but that has to be calculated. It's not going to just be simple. I would recommend we leave it pretty vague on like sort of what technologies count, like to name another really simple one, like water heater tanks can be controlled by your utility, and then you just have a mixer that delivers the same water temperature to you at all times, but your tank can fluctuate as the utility needs it to. That's the residential program that exists today or will soon, but that doesn't even exist for commercial. So like some of those it's enabling like the fact that it's automation that we're talking about, right? I think you have that, but just, like if we can focus on the principles, then I think this is a good concept. It's not going to get someone like all the way to compliance, right? But it could be something like credits and reduces their EUI. I kind of think that's where we are going on electrification too, right? These aren't like totally separate pathways. It's like a way of reducing your EUI target or something, right?
Yeah, thank you. That's exactly kind of what we're going for, is coming up with these principles, even if maybe all of these programs don't yet exist. I think, we need to think about the future standards and how buildings will be able to comply in 2026. So Kara, did you have something to add?
No, I think this is a really exciting conversation. I agree. This is a very kind of 2030 type of effort, which is really exciting that we're able to kind of craft it in here now. I think demand response is here today, and that's different than demand flexibility, but I think it's the precursor, and it puts the right technologies in buildings to accommodate future demand flexibility, which is much more fine-tuned shifting based on different grid signals or different attributes being congestion or cost or emissions, whereas demand response really is kind of signals, 10, a dozen, 20 events a year. So I guess there's a couple different ways that we might consider this. One, I think we should consider putting forth a recommendation for a proposal as to how this could be incorporated today to provide like an EUI credit. So if we say, if you participate in a DR program, maybe you could get like a 10 or a 20% reduction in your EUI, just to show kind of similar to the electrification path, some kind of, stake in the ground to do this. And then I think that there could be like a second set of recommendations to the AQCC that are like the principles and the credits that Katrina was mentioning.
Thank you. We just have a couple of minutes left. Kirk?
I just wanted to piggyback off of that, Kara. I really like that, the recommendations set on principles, because I'm definitely not an expert in this space, but I'm just trying to put myself in the shoes of a building owner trying to interpret this, and the AQCC trying to administer this it seems very ambiguous and difficult, and could frustrate people in the long run. So it's like, I'm hearing two things. Are we recommending some sort of prescriptive technology, or are we recommending participation in some sort of utilities program? And overall, it sounds like we kind of are aligned on putting together what the intent might be for this type of recommendation, and maybe we focus more on principles or what the intent of what this is trying to achieve, and not try to be too prescriptive or piggyback off of existing utility programs since they're already kind of in place.
Yeah, I like that. Joel?
Just to echo, since it's not written out here explicitly, I've heard suggestions that we include storage, whether that's thermal or electrical storage, thermal being the hot water heaters. I think those need to be considered eligible, as well as vehicle to grid, which was another one that was mentioned.
I just put
Katrina?
something in the chat, but I realized I don't think we can count this because the utility is going to count the emission reductions from their DR program towards meeting their emission reduction targets. We're not allowed to double count per the legislation underlying this task force. We can't give building owners credit for the same thing a utility is going to claim credit for. We can't include any of this, can we?
I'm not sure that utilities do claim emission credits for demand response. That might be the case with Excel. I would need to defer to the PUC on that, but it is not common from my experience for a utility to get any type of emission credit for that.
Excel
It's
is
really
going to hit
economic.
their 80%. My understanding is Excel will reach their 80% target by just showing total emissions on their system to the AQCC. And this is a strategy that helps them reduce those total emissions on their system. So maybe it varies from utility to utility, but
Yeah, we'll have to check on that. Thank you for raising that, Katrina. Well, we are just about out of time. I'm sorry, it was just a short 1 hour, but it was a great discussion and we can bring forward some of these ideas and proposals. I like the idea of, forming these principles in general that are forward-looking principles that the AQCC can consider. So let's see. Next steps. Really just wanted to remind everyone about the next task force meeting in 2 weeks. And we will be talking again, we'll bring forward some of this discussion and talk about alternate compliance pathways as well. And then start planning some of that public engagement as well. So thank you all. We've captured all of your comments and through your chat and everything. So I really appreciate you attending this optional meeting and providing your thoughts. This is super helpful. And we'll do another one. We'll do another optional meeting after the next full task force meeting as well. So thank you.